I'm going to have Haley turn down the lights on that so you can see a little bit better, and maybe we'll go to the next screen. And this is just by way of opening. After the conference that we led, and I'll say a little more about the conferences themselves in a couple moments, but at the end of the conference, several of the participants came up to me, and they all said something very similar. They said, "We want you to make sure that you go back to your churches and back to your families and that you thank them." And they were quite insistent on that. And I did that with my family. I want you to know that. But I want to share that with you as well. And the reason is this. I've done 5 or 6 trips with IDEM now, going to different places. And every time I come back, I have the very strong sense that this is not about me going somewhere and doing this work and then coming back. This is really a work of Sunnyslope Church. My ability to go to Sunnyslope or to these places and to teach for several days at a time is because Sunnyslope allows me to do that and supports me in doing that. And that is not lost on me. I want you to know that. I am just so profoundly grateful that you've encouraged me to do that. And I want you also to know that this is one of the ways that you, as a church, are supporting what God is doing in many places around the world. In other words, this work that you're going to hear about tonight is really, in that sense, it's a part of the work that you are involved in, the work that you are supporting, and the way that you are helping the churches in these other places to grow and to be strengthened. So the church in Romania recognized that. I want you to hear that from me and to understand that as well, that this really is a work of Sunnyslope Church. It's an extension of our work as a body. This time I was in the place, a city called Campina in Romania. I'll put the map up there. I'll just give you 2 maps real briefly. That gives you an overview of the region. You can see Romania there. The city of Bucharest is the main city. I'll tell you a little more about the country, although I have to admit Camelia's here tonight, and she knows far more about her own country than I do. I was only there a week, and so, Camelia is by far the expert. But anyways, you see the country of Romania, and then there's Bucharest again, and then where the big blue arrow is, that's where the city of Campina is. It was about maybe an hour and a half drive north out of Bucharest. That's where it is location-wise. Now, a little bit about the country in general. It's a very old country. It was settled many hundreds of years ago, thousands of years ago, actually. But you can even see on the map that it's in a place that is strategic in some ways because it's at the intersection of Southeast Europe with the rest of Eastern Europe, and it has a border on the Black Sea, which has long encouraged trade throughout the country. The other countries that it borders are Ukraine, Hungary, Moldova, Serbia, and Bulgaria. So it's got quite a few countries surrounding it. Population-wise, it's about 20 million people, which sounds like a lot, and it is a lot. It's a country about the size of Oregon, roughly. Maybe a little bit. I think it's a little bit bigger than Oregon, but not much. I think I looked it up online. I think it was closest in size to the state of Michigan, but it's pretty close in terms of area to the size of Oregon. Bucharest is by far the most populated city in the country, of course, and then a lot of those, you can see some of those other little cities and towns along the way. One of the features that we enjoyed while we were there was the Carpathian Mountains, and you can put the next slide up too there, Devin. The Carpathian Mountains form kind of a backwards-facing L that kind of would go across the country, and for a good part of our time, we were in those mountains, and I'll tell you, it was absolutely beautiful. Of course, it was snowing, which kind of added to the storybook feel of it all. It was really very pretty, but a little bit cold. We weren't expecting, and we were told that was very unusual to get that amount of snow. Romania is mainly made up of ethnic Romanians, but also the other 2 large ethnicities are the Gypsy population and the Hungarian population. And there's some tension between those groups historically, between all 3 groups, but that was just an observation I made wherever I've ever traveled. There's always tension between different ethnicities, and I think there's a lesson in that, right? I think that's just part of our fallen nature, that we tend to cluster with people most like us, and we tend to be somewhat ambiguous at best and maybe hostile at worst towards those of a different group. So, but there, yeah, so there's some history of tension between other ethnicities there in Romania. Let's put the next slide up. A bit of the history again. I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail about this, but more, and I'm only speaking history in the last 100 years or so. It was an ally of, actually we'll just keep it post-World War II. It was an ally of Germany during the first few years of the Second World War, and then it changed allegiances later in the war, and it became an ally of the Allied powers. Post-World War II, though, it was an Eastern Bloc country. It joined the Warsaw Pact, and so it was allied with communism. So for a long time, it was under communist leadership and under communist dictatorship of Nicolae Ceausescu was probably the most famous. There was two dictators in the time of when it became full communist to when communism fell. I think there were only two dictators. The most infamous one, I guess, was Ceausescu, and he was quite a harsh dictator. But in 1989, that's when communism fell in Romania. In fact, I remember when I was a kid, I was 10 years old, and I remember hearing on the radio the reports, and they were reporting live from the city streets in Bucharest. And I didn't understand at the time, but I remember hearing about Romania and this pivotal moment in Romanian history. And it turns out that indeed was a very transformative moment. Communism fell, and that allowed then capitalism and Western thought in, which economically has greatly improved the country, although it's still an economically developing country, but it is a member of the European Union, and that has allowed trade and economic growth pretty dramatically. In fact, when I compare Ukraine and Romania, Romania was quite a bit more economically advanced because Romania has been part of the European Union and has had access to that trade and that economic opportunity. So. Let's see, next slide. So a little bit about the religious history. Romanian Orthodoxy is by far the largest religion in the country. I think it's probably somewhere around close to 90% would claim that. This is a picture of the oldest church in Bucharest. It was, I believe it was, I forget the name of it, St. Stephen's, I think, an Orthodox church. We walked through Old Town Bucharest, beautiful, old, very old buildings. We're talking very old in the United States is like 100, maybe 150 years old. Very old in Romania is about 800 years old. So this church was built in about the year 1200. It was destroyed by fire, or nearly destroyed by fire, in the 1800s, and then it was rebuilt. But it's still on the site of the original, and it's still part of the original church. Beautiful church. I'll show you in a minute a couple of photos from inside these churches. But what our host shared with us is that for many people, Romanian Orthodoxy is more of a cultural identity than it is actually a spiritual, genuine relationship with Jesus Christ. Most people just, if you're Romanian, you just claim to be part of the Orthodox Church. That's just what you are. But it's, like I said, it's more ritual than it is anything substantive. And that's been declining, at least according to our host. He said that involvement and engagement with the Orthodox Church with the younger generation is going down. And like many countries across the West, secularism is growing quite quickly. Now, other denominations there include, there is a Pentecostal and Baptist. There are very few Reformed churches in Romania, and even the churches we were partnering with and serving were Baptist churches. But you have to remember, Baptist churches are not like Southern Baptists that you might run into here in the United States. There's some commonality, but there's also some differences. And one of them, I think, is that they tend to be a little bit more open to Reformed ideas and Reformed theology. So anyways, all right. Let's see, next slide. So this is inside one of the Orthodox churches in Bucharest, and you can just see you had to be very subtle about taking pictures. You know, it'd be kind of like someone coming in here and snapping pictures during a church service. It wouldn't be maybe the best thing, but I did manage to get a couple of photos, and I was just simply amazed by the beautiful windows, and in a minute I'll show you an altarpiece, but you can just see the beauty and the attention to detail that was in these churches. And then maybe the next one, which is, I think, that altarpiece. This is at the front of the Orthodox Church, and that one of the Orthodox churches there, and of course, while we were in there, it's open to tourists, but people are coming in while it's like open all the time for people to come in and say their prayers and to touch the icons and to kiss the icons and light candles and all those other things. And those who did that obviously took it very seriously. It was a very important ritual to them. But I was more just noticing just the beauty of these buildings. If nothing else, they were very, very old, but very, very ornate and really quite beautiful. So, all right, next slide. So I put this picture up just a little bit by way of religious history. There's one city in Romania, at least I'm told there's really just one, that was settled by the Germans, and this was the city of Brașov. It was about maybe 2.5 hours north of Bucharest, and we spent Saturday afternoon there. After the conference, we had a little extra time, and it's a beautiful city up in the mountains again. But in the middle of the city is this church, and they call it the Black Church. Now in America, if we said Black Church, we might refer to like an African American congregation. Here, it was a Lutheran congregation that, again, dating back about 800 years. And it was a black church because at one point it had burned down, or the outside of it. There'd been a big fire in the city square, and so it had scorched a lot of the buildings, and it was turned the church black. We could not get into this church. We missed it by about 30 minutes, unfortunately, but they have organ concerts there like twice a week during the summer, and then otherwise you can go in and tour it, but we missed that. But beautiful little city, and then you can see in the background of the city, you see this large cathedral looming up there. In fact, if you put the next picture up, you'll see the little piazza there, or the little plaza, and then the church looming over. Now, if you look really, really close, you can see there's that orange building immediately to the right of the cathedral, and there's a Starbucks coffee shop in that orange building right next to the cathedral. So, and you actually would see that all those buildings that you see there are these really old buildings, but there's like a KFC in one of them and the Starbucks, and so it's kind of that mix of old and new. But then, like I said, you see this cathedral sitting high on top of the overlooking the city. So that's a little bit about Romania, but I want to share a little bit more and maybe go into a little more detail about what the work of IDEM is all about. So let's put the next slide up there. IDEM is, most of you have heard of it before, because I've shared about it a number of times before, but it's International Theological Educational Ministries. So it's easier just to say IDEM. But that's what they are about, and their mission is to provide biblically based Reformed teaching and training worldwide to indigenous church leaders for ministry. In a nutshell, what IDEM is really all about is trying to equip local pastors and local leaders to do the work of ministry. In other words, rather than going in and doing the actual ministry of preaching and teaching and planting churches, IDEM is trying to train the locals to do that work, because they are in a far better position to do that work. They know the culture. They understand the people. They're committed for the long term. And so what IDEM does is to recognize that many people in North America have training that those in developing countries, especially Eastern European countries, they don't have that training. They don't have access to that training. Most of them couldn't leave and go to seminary for 3 years. They just couldn't do it. They need to put food on the table for their families. They can't leave behind the demands of church and ministry. And so what we do is, I say we. I'm on the board with IDEM, and that's why I say we. What IDEM does is it sends in pastors who will go and work at seminaries, who can give a 1-week course for pastors. Or what I am involved in is we do 3-day preaching seminars, and we teach expository preaching. And so that's, again, IDEM mostly focuses on former Eastern Bloc countries. Romania, Ukraine, Lithuania, Latvia. They've done some work in Russia. We've expanded out since in the last couple of years to Kenya, Bolivia, and India and Indonesia. And so because there's a need there in those places very much as well. And so the work is expanding because the excitement for these conferences and for the training is growing. I want to show you a picture of the Vasily family. This is in the center there, standing there with his wife, is Pastor. He would tell you he would introduce himself as Pastor John and his wife Helen, but we would actually say, or in Romanian it would be Ion and Elena. I believe. So John and Helen, and their three of their children are in that picture, as well as some other family members, and then a daughter-in-law and two little granddaughters there on the end. They, as a family, and there are a couple of other family members that aren't in the picture, but they are really involved. They are the ones that are pastoring. He's the pastor of the church. It's called Maranatha Church there in Campina. And he pastors the church, and his whole family is really involved in the ministry. Most of them work, outside jobs, but they spend a lot of time helping out around the church. His daughter, Ioana, who is standing to the right in the white shirt, she coordinates the conferences there. She's the one that takes care of all the logistical details and plays a huge supporting role in putting these conferences on. So it was just they're a neat family, and they are all involved in that work of ministry. And they're the ones that helped us put together the preaching conference. A little bit about the conferences that we lead. So next slide. The preaching conferences that myself and Pastor Bill Wilton and Pastor Perry Tinklenberg from Spokane, the conferences we put on focus on preaching, and we really break them down into three parts. The first part that we do is the lecture. We teach. We try to explain the material on expository preaching, which is preaching through a text rather than sort of picking a topic and then pulling 10 or 12 Bible verses out that support your topic. We teach how do you preach through, say, the Gospel of John or the book of Galatians or 2 Samuel, and we teach kind of those principles. So the first thing we got to do is we got to just explain what are we talking about and how do you do it? How do you preach and listen to a text in order to preach it? And so we do 5 lectures, and they focus on everything from what is expository preaching to how do you pick up what the message of a whole book of the Bible is, how do you pick up what is a message of a text, how do you connect the message of a text to the work of Jesus Christ, and then how do you structure a sermon. So in 5 lectures, that's what we've got to cover. So we have to cover a lot of ground in a fairly quick amount of time. But then what we also do is we break them into groups, and we do workshops with them. So we give them texts to work with. Usually each group will get one text, and then they have to take what we've taught them, and they have to do the work in a group. And so I will facilitate one of the groups, and Bill will facilitate one, and then we say, okay, we talked about how to look for repeated words in a passage. What repeated words do you see? Or we talked about how to point to the person and work of Jesus Christ. How would you do that from this text? And we just take them through it, and it's surprising that you can actually see them grasping it even in the span of 3 days. It's not to say that they'll get it all in one conference, but the wheels begin to turn, and it does begin to make sense for them. So the lecture, the workshop, and then we preach 4 different sermons between the two of us. I'll preach 2 sermons, and Bill will preach 2, and we always have to kind of explain, this is a little bit artificial because we're preaching in a teaching setting, but we do want to make it a worship setting, but we also encourage them to look for the principles that we've been teaching, to identify them in the sermons that they're hearing. And usually they can do that, and then sometimes what we'll do is we'll debrief after the sermon and say, okay, in the sermon you just heard, you may have noticed that I did this and this and this. And then that way, then it's like the light goes on, and they say, oh yeah, okay, now we know what you mean. So we teach it, we work with them, and we model it. And again, it takes 3-day conference, really from 8 in the morning till 5 or 6 at night each day, with some break time worked in between there. Let's go to the next slide. This is I think it's either the 3rd or the 4th conference that ITEM has put on in Romania. I've only been to Romania once, but Bill went, I think, 2 other times. What we do is we have these different modules that we work with. And so we've taught Christ-centered preaching from the book of Psalms. We've taught from the book of 1 Samuel. We've taught from the Gospels. Some of the key principles remain the same, right? The techniques on preaching remain the same, but then we also focus on a specific genre of Scripture. We say, okay, here are the principles of preaching. They're going to stay the same, but what if you're going to preach from a gospel? What specific things might you need to know? And so that way they're actually hearing the same key principles every time they come to a conference. And we're seeing some of the same people coming from one conference to the next. They're hearing the same ideas repeated, but then they're also learning specifically how to apply those in a different text of Scripture or a different genre of Scripture. This time we focused on how do you preach Christ from the epistles, from the letters. And we worked through the book of Galatians. And the way we structured, the way we set it up is that by the end of the conference, each participant has really 9 sermons in the works that they could go home and then preach. And so that helps them out as well. But we've also taught them from the book of Galatians, and they've picked up some material in the book of Galatians as well as in preaching. So, quick couple pictures just of what the church was like. There on the left, you see the church building. It was really a beautiful, actually, it was a fairly new building, beautiful building, I actually thought, but it was very wintry. I'm told that it's very unusual to get snow in Romania in the end of March, but we had a lot of snow. In fact, one day they had to close all the schools on account of the snowstorm. So, but they didn't cancel the conference, of course. They went ahead with it. We just had to, hunker down and stay warm. But as I said, it made it look all kind of fairy tale-like. A couple pictures from the conference. Next slide up. You can see there again. It just kind of gives you a taste. From the lectures to small group time, and then I just noticed on the bottom left 2 pictures. One of the younger participants, and then probably the oldest participant that was there. It was just kind of neat to see that real range in ages. Some of the younger pastors or elders were just starting out in ministry, or they were just involved in some form of lay leadership, and then some of the pastors had been there. They'd been ministering for many years, but there was a good spread of ages there. Some of you may have seen pictures of John Stott before. He was the great Anglican pastor, preacher. That guy looked exactly like John Stott, and every time I saw him, I thought, oh, there's John Stott, but it wasn't him. All right, next picture. This is a picture of the whole group, and so you can see there were a couple of folks missing there, but it was a group of about 25 to 30 participants. I'll kind of let you do the Where's Waldo thing and find out where I'm standing, but that gives you just a sense of the group that we were with and the pastors that were working with us. But it was really a wonderful group of people, and really very, very warm and friendly. In fact, I asked one of our Romanian hosts. I said, tell me, what is it that how would people describe Romanian culture? What are some of the things they would say? And the couple of people that talked about it a little bit, and they said, well, I think one of the things you'd find is that we're very hospitable, and I completely agreed with that. They'd say they're very warm and friendly, and that was also very true. We found them to be very, very open, very, very eager to talk with us, and so we were just really, really impressed, and we really enjoyed the hospitality and the warmth of the people there. We took a day. This was before the conference. We did a little tour up, and I'll just show you. These are a couple of kind of random pictures. The next one up. This is Palace Castle. It's in the city of Sinaia. Dates back to the time when Romania had a monarchy, and this is where the king would go. But we were able to tour around a little bit, but I didn't take many pictures inside because they wanted a fair bit of money to do that. And I still hadn't figured out how to convert the Romanian currency into American currency, and so I didn't know if I was getting ripped off or not, and so I didn't want to risk it. But beautiful building. Outside is absolutely gorgeous. It looked really like a storybook pictures. Even in the winter. Of course, I have to tell Bill this and just embarrass him a little bit. As we were walking up, they didn't ice any of the sidewalks or anything like that, and the terrain was kind of rugged, and so Bill actually did a face plant right down on the ground, and thankfully he wasn't very badly hurt, but for a minute I was worried I had to do the conference by myself. So, and next picture, just a few pictures on the food. The food was, I don't usually like to come and talk about all the food because then it just sounds like I'm in it for what I get to eat, and I'm really not, but the food was absolutely delicious there. We got to try out a number of Romanian restaurants and different types of cuisine, the chicken and the pork, and then eating meals together every day was a big part of the hospitality that they shared with us. So breakfast every day was usually way more than I eat for breakfast on any given day, and lunch was the same way, but it was so good. I brought a little food to share tonight. Now, I have to confess, only one of the things that I was able to find was actual Romanian food. The others are Ukrainian, so I'm cheating a little bit. I'm sorry, but the little European bakery up on Commercial there, I asked the lady, I said, I need Romanian food, and she found one thing, and then the others were Romanian. But it's all Eastern European, so it's all good that way. But then this way you get to try a little bit of it. But then I think I got one last picture there, the next picture up. This was church on Sunday morning. I got the chance to preach in the regular worship service at the Maranatha Church, and that was kind of a neat thing to get to do. It's all done through a translator. Their church service ran about 2 hours, so a little longer. And they actually had, it was kind of neat. They had, the first guy got up and he shared, it was, I guess I would say it was a devotional. It was probably a 15-minute little devotional, something that he'd read, and then he shared it. And then there was prayer for the churches, and then prayer for all the countries, and then there was time of, they were reading through the whole Bible, and so every Sunday they just read 3 chapters. And people take turns and they just read it. They don't say much about it, but they're just, they hope in a couple of years they've gone through the whole Bible. So then after that, then it was my turn to preach. And then, by the time even a shortened sermon, which I preach, by the time you bring it through a translator, it doubles in length. And so, my 15-minute sermon was like a 30-minute sermon. But it was a wonderful, wonderful service. And to me, that's always one of the highlights because it's a reminder that, yes, culturally our churches are very different. But, we sang, for example, Holy, 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 which we sang this morning in church. And it's always a reminder that there are differences culturally, right? Every church is going to worship Jesus Christ in a way that's culturally appropriate, but there's also a great deal of commonality there. And so to see the way that we worship the same Lord, and yet we do it in different ways is always just such a profound thing for me to see, and it's always a highlight of the trip. The sign on the right that you can see is a text from 1 Corinthians 1:23, which says, "We preach Christ crucified," and that hangs above above the pulpit. And then opposite, like on the back wall, it has the three phrases: one Lord, one faith, one baptism. And so again, there's that idea that that's what joins us together, right? As Christians here in Salem, Oregon, and Christians in Campina, Romania, and other places around the world. That's always a great thing to see. I brought actually a video. It's not going to work to play it, unfortunately, but I always record the video of singing because, again, you'll hear the song and you'd recognize it right away. It's sung in a different language, but you'll know the tune. But I put a couple of those on Facebook. You can go back and find those. And then last picture on the left there, with the kind of the lit up building. That's in downtown Old Town Bucharest. We spent as I said, a couple of hours there, and we ate a great dinner down there. And then on the right is Brasov again, that little mountain town. So, so that's about it. Wonderful trip. So again, thank you for your support. I got time maybe for a couple of questions if there are any, anything that maybe I didn't cover or things that you'd want to know about. Yeah, Gerben. Yep. Yeah. So yes, all the teaching is done in English, and then it's done through an interpreter. And but what our interpreter told us is that most of the younger people in Romania speak pretty good English, and I noticed that as well. The older people, it's hit or miss. Some do, some don't. But again, growing up under communism, and it was a more closed-off country, you wouldn't have exposure to that. But the younger folks have actually had a lot of exposure to English. Now, I will say that, by no means did I pick up the language at all while I was there. Of course not. But I was able to pick up more phrases than I was, say, of Ukrainian, because Ukrainian or Russian, it's a different alphabet. There are far fewer connections with English. But by the end of the conference, I was actually able to sing along with, the words would be projected on the screen, and I could sing along. And I think I was doing it okay, but but because you can learn some of the inflection of the different words and so on, it helps that I studied French a lot in school when I was younger, because French and English and Italian and Romanian and a number of others are all Romance languages, and so they share a lot of common sentence structure, and that helped. But I actually felt like with a little time and effort, if I'd stayed there for long term, I felt that I could probably pick up the language a little quicker than I could if it was like Russian. So, other questions? In the cities, it would be like in Bucharest. Again, Bucharest was a city of about 1 million people. Size-wise, it didn't strike me as a huge city geographically, and it was a fairly busy city. But the outlying little towns, like the city where the conference was in Campina, was not a real densely populated city. It was bigger than like a little village, but it certainly wasn't like what you find in Portland or even in Salem. So, other questions? Yeah.